I'm Alex Magoun, David Sarnoff Library, and those of you that were on the Reflector today, yesterday, may have seen some of the discussion regarding the RCA video disc player and the video disc, which was a $500 million write-off for RCA shortly before GE bought it in 1986. And I wrote a little couple of paragraphs sort of giving some of the business technical background to the project, which is very nicely written up by a woman named Margaret Graham, RCA and the video disc, available in paperback and by interlibrary loan. And people said, why would they possibly do something like that? And there are a lot of very sound reasons going back to the 1950s when David Sarnoff asked for home video as the next technology after color television. And RCA spent the next 30 years trying to figure out the right format for home video playback. Not the music you want when you want it, but the video you want when you want it, which became called in the 60s selective vision. You're going to select your video. And in the 50s, Harry Olson, head of the acoustics lab, said, well, the obvious way would be to take a phonograph record and simply scale it up to do video recording. And he got several patents from this. John Logie Baird, those of you that know about that very cool site by Donald...
TV Dawn.
What's that?
TV Dawn.
TV Dawn?
TVDawn.com.
TV Dawn, I forgot. It's Donald McLean has this excellent, where he has actually gotten the pictures, the video off of these 78 RPM records that Logie Baird recorded back in like 1928. Well, that continued into the 60s in various ways. It's sort of a race between magnetic videotape. How are you going to compress a color video signal on a magnetic tape that originally did sound? And how are you going to do the same thing on a video record? And then what if you used lasers and holograms instead of just, grooves and frequencies? And over here, you guys are probably the first people besides the inventor and myself to see. These are holograms stamped or engraved on discs, 1965, 66. This is like 6 years after the laser was invented. And I think this one with my fingerprints all over it, and you can see there's a little holographic, two-dimensional hologram etched around the outside. And then they pressed it on a record here, and you'll notice it's the RCA Victor, the old sort of format, which suggests that it's before 1968. This is like 1967 with the normal cycle, and again it's got this series of frames of some movie or film strip that if we had the right kind of laser at the right angle, we could read off the interference patterns. And then they went from these, they said, well, what if we put those on something cheap, like PVC film? So, this is the press release package from 1969, which took place in this auditorium on September 30th, where they introduced Selectivision, which was taking holograms and putting them on a strip of PVC tape. So this tape, or the one that's on the player behind the stage, has a whole episode of Get Smart on a laser hologram. And I've actually tried to convince Mike Lurie, who was sort of in charge of the project, could you restore that so we could play it at that laser that's at 18 degrees off, center? He hasn't gone for it yet, but I'm hoping he'll change his mind. And you're wondering, well, how are they going to make each of these tapes? You're not just running these past a magnetic head. You've got to stamp each of those holograms. And the answer was it was going to be a copper-nickel master strip that would be pressed, that the plastic strips would be pressed against and form these very fine holograms, two-dimensional holograms on these metal strips. Well, if you're thinking like I am, you're saying, what a totally insane idea. How much is one of those players going to cost in the home? How are you going to align that laser? We would have to completely invest in a complete new factory because this has nothing to do with magnetic tape or records. And so the video disc people sort of came back and they said, with electron beam recording, using electron beams instead of lasers, we can record 10,000 grooves to an inch in a record, which people can then slide into their record, plop on their record player, like this, trial picture here, and you can pick this record up like this and just plop it down. and they built 200 players in, I think, 1972, 73. And here's, your contemporary Brady Bunch girl on her 1970s daybed, holding her record. You can see her fingers all over the grooves, listening on her Princess phone in her space-age sort of weird 2001 module house. And they found out that, gee, cigarette ash, dog hair, spittle, vomit, all this stuff in the air completely gums up the grooves. And so we're going to have to build a cassette for these, which is going to be heavy. It's going to be difficult to educate people which end to put in. You'll notice it says which, insert other end. And then you had problems with the electron beam recorder, which all the physicists loved in the laboratory. It says, electron beam, we've never done this before. And yet there was always a flaw right. You were always getting a spot where you screwed up the recording, and you could never get below that error rate, and you would have too many errors. So then there was a small group saying, why don't we just go back to a really sophisticated diamond stylus like we do for normal records? The physicists don't want that. That's old-fashioned technology. That goes back, 70 years. And it took a long time to drop the electron beam, which seemed technologically state-of-the-art, to something that seemed, technologically obsolescent, to make a diamond stylus that could cut 10,000 grooves to the inch for a capacitance readout. And back here you can see they switched over to having a handle. You'll also notice this is the width of a 45 RPM spindle for convenience. These records rotated at 450 RPM, not 45 RPM incidentally. And then you had issues with, well, what are you going to put on the surface of this record to prevent it from wearing out? You put oil, the oil attracts dust and all sorts of gunk. If you plate it, how do you plate a metal to a plastic? How do you make these things stick together and not delaminate? And so they went through a variety of gold plating, copper nickel plating, going into basic polyvinyl chloride and loading it up with more carbon to make it more electrically conductive. And it wasn't until 1981 that this whole system debuted. In the interim, RCA had gone through 5 CEOs. They each paused. You never know what you're going to do with the corporation. The magnetic tape people, partly sponsored by RCA, developed the VHS and the beta and the pneumatic tapes. And by the time they got this on the market, not only was there already a fixed bunch of VHS tape players, but people began to rent the tapes. And now all of a sudden the price advantage for a system with a $400 player versus a $600 to $900 VHS tape player, and $20, $15 records versus a $60 to $80 videotape. I remember Indiana Jones was going to come out for $80 on one tape. Would you pay that much? No. Why don't you go down to the rental store and pay $3? All of a sudden, your video disc looks a lot less useful. Now, I might add that they kept pushing what you could do with this technology. This blank-looking shrink wrap says Bally Football. This was the interactive video game that they worked at, Oxford Valley Mall, down Route 95 outside of Philadelphia. They talked to a bunch of guys named Vinny and Tony and hooked this into a video arcade. And it was a football game where you chose which way the quarterback was going to go or throw, and they had little bits of footage, and then you watched the outcome, and then you did the next game. And then they did a home version, the mystery disc, Murder Anyone, and you had your choices. These could have been read by lasers, but lasers cost an arm and a leg at a time, and the point was to make a $400 player. They also did get a number of people say, oh, well, in the early 80s, they never got into porn. I mean, there's a big market. I hate to redden the ears of the younger people here. But here we will notice the very discreet cover of Emmanuel 4, rated R. It's a 1986. It's probably one of the last video discs they pressed commercially. They did have a Playboy. They had several of them. They were all sort of softcore. And then the last video disc they ever pressed is called Thanks for the Memories. And they pressed 20 million of these records. So when you say, geez, I can't find a video disc, you're not trying very hard. One might point out that what did they make as like the comment, the world will little note nor long remember, ... Abraham Lincoln at the Gettysburg Address talking about Gettysburg. And you can't tell, well, that's Gettysburg. Of course we're going to remember Gettysburg, because that was what Lincoln was saying. But there's sort of an ironic question. Did they really think that the world would remember the video disc, or was it a terribly sarcastic, self-defeating, no, the world will never remember the video disc? But fortunately, here we are, 20 years later, remembering the video disc. Thank you.